Hi, welcome to Module 2 or Week 2 of our course. I hope that the first week gave you a sense of the rhythm of the schedule and just how you can plan for your own week moving forward. I do apologize for the way the course first started out, especially with all the different moving parts and just my own issues of logging into Blackboard. There was a number of sort of server issues, and so I wasn't able to get in and update things and couldn't even log into the website before the class even started, which was frustrating. So I do apologize for that. So if you also experience Blackboard issues, just know that there's a lot of grace and we can, I'm generally pretty flexible about deadlines as long as you just send me an email and let me know. These sorts of weekly videos, and you've seen some prior to this that were actually created this spring or even last summer, but they'll kind of give you a running commentary of the course. And you're going to see a variety of these videos. Some were created by Professor Vanderbergy for the course. Some will be created by myself. And then you'll also see some photos that I took for this course, specifically when I went on an archaeological dig last summer to Israel and Jordan. This is my third time teaching the course, and there's always little bits of things. So I'm excited to kind of include some fresh content and some new projects for this particular round of the course. I think a few people commented on just how much they learned in the last module and maybe at times how they felt a little bit overwhelmed. So regardless of if you grew up a Christian or went to maybe even grew up in a Christian school, or maybe if you're not at all part of the faith tradition, just know that it can be a little bit overwhelming. And as someone whose specialty is Hebrew and biblical poetry, and I've gone to Princeton Seminary, like I mentioned earlier, that doesn't mean that I also didn't find this course challenging when I took it as an undergraduate student back when I was a student at Northwestern over a decade ago. So we're covering a lot. Know that there is a lot to this. And you'll also probably feel it in the pacing of our course, because if you're taking this in the summer, it's 7 weeks. In the spring, it's 8. And if you're taking it in person at Northwestern, it's actually 16 weeks. So everything from 16 weeks has been condensed into 7 or 8 weeks. So there is this sort of fast pace to what we're doing and this sort of double time thing. So you'll probably feel that. But I hope that this sort of pace will still offer enough time to do some of those extra projects like the final paper. Which, speaking of, there are 2 bonus options available. The first is a brand new project where it's called Practicing Biblical Studies, and you'll receive 5 bonus points on your total quiz grades if you submit that by Saturday, June 17th at 11:59 Central Time. And this is a way for you to integrate what you're learning from the course into your everyday life, whether that's through possibly an art project if you're an art major, or maybe a Sunday school lesson plan, or even a lesson plan if possibly if you can teach that if you work in a Christian preschool. There'll be more details forthcoming on kind of what that looks like. It'll be more of a creative assignment because it is, or creative option, I should say, since it's a bonus option. And I will post more details in the coming weeks of what that will look like. The other bonus option, or hopefully additional bonus option, is towards your final paper, and you'll get 2 bonus points on your final paper if you submit a draft of your paper by the 24th of June and schedule a Zoom feedback with me before the June 30th deadline. Now, as I mentioned before, I'm generally pretty flexible on deadlines. I know you're all busy with many other things on your plate besides this course. The one deadline that I can't budge on is the June 30th because I have to turn in final grades. So some of those other things, I would say, yes, there's a bit of flexibility, although the quiz grades actually do have a bit of a deadline, and it's a mission for me to change those. If you have a writing assignment or a Friday or Saturday, something comes up in your family, just send me an email. And I just ask that you send me an email and just let me know that you need a little bit of extra time. More on the quizzes. So you've taken 2 and you've gotten those under your belt, and you're probably getting a better sense of how to prepare for those and how much to time yourself through them. You might get a sense that these are not really quizzes you can brush aside, but you actually have to pay attention to all the reading and the lectures. Last summer, when I taught this course for the first time, I did a bit of an experiment, and I just took the quiz kind of thinking, well, I'll just sort of see how it goes. And prior to reviewing, re-reviewing this material, because I haven't looked at it in over a decade, probably like 15 years almost. And I could tell the difference from when I took the quiz and hadn't looked at any material from when I actually went back and reviewed all the readings and lectures, just to kind of refresh my own memory since it has been a bit. So you can't just guess. All the answers might sound plausible, and some of them actually sound quite plausible. So if you don't know the material, it does show on those quizzes. Now, I do know the quizzes are are challenging in this course. And so that's why I've offered that sort of optional creative project so that you can feel like there's a little bit of cushion and that not so much of your grade rests on your quizzes. You can't really Google answers for those because you'll notice those quizzes really don't. So you're really your best option to do well on the quizzes is to watch the lectures, read the material, take careful notes. And it is a perfectly acceptable option to use your notes on the quizzes. This is a valid learning method. You can, listen to those. Like you don't necessarily always have to sit. I know it's kind of hard to sort of sit and listen to a lecture in the summer, like if you like to garden or maybe work out. I often found that when I was going on runs and I was reviewing the material, it was nice to be able to do a workout and listen to those, which might feel or sound kind of dorky, but it does help. But if you're struggling with the quizzes, then please just contact me earlier and we can try to work out a study strategy. Again, you can use all of the notes that you take when you watch the lectures and when you review the note material or the reading material. So those are certainly acceptable to use alongside the quizzes. What's also been built in the course you've noticed is discussion boards and reflection essays. Please don't squander. These are easy points. And as a reminder, I do just want you to write clearly, concisely, and thesis centered, which means focusing on building and arguing one main point. And write your discussion so that someone can maybe build off this point and like further the discussion in other directions. These discussion posts are different than the reflection essays. The reflection has a bit more of a personal tone, whereas the discussion, hopefully fosters more of what you're learning in the course. I do offer, comments on grammar or content, so do try to, take those into consideration as well. One of the major goals for this course is so that you can become a better writer. So I will, you'll notice I am a little picky about the writing and I will sort of push you to write more, to think in other directions. It's not because your first idea wasn't good. It's just because I want you to grow in your writing and that will help you in your other courses at Northwestern that are also writing centric like this one is. One essay each week will be chosen and posted, and that will sort of foster that discussion. If your essay is chosen and posted, you don't have to offer. You're welcome to, but you're not required to offer then that sort of free points for you. You don't have to respond that week. And likewise, please go back through the biblical message assignment posted on Blackboard and carefully read through all the resources. I'm updating that because I've just noticed in this course the need for more electronic resources. Please don't necessarily just Google whatever you see. It is important to use scholarly resources, and you can't just Google the book of Romans and get something good. There is a little bit more of a method to that. There's also resources available and at your disposal already on that folder, I guess I should call it. And it might sound pedantic, but do read all the instructions and all the supplementary material before you write and engage with this biblical message assignment. There are commentaries, and please use your New Oxford Annotated Bible as you also prepare for those assignments. So this first week, it was a bit more of a entry in. This next week will be a little bit more of a deep dive into literary methods. That will also give you less commentary from me if you kind of read the instructions, and it'll go towards helping write your final paper. So I do try to look at comments I do write comments on all of your assignments. So do go back through the grade book and look at your comments, and that will help you build on your assignments from there. Now, both this first module and the second are much lighter in their workload. And then the class kind of peaks in 3 through 5, and then 6 and 7 are lighter. But I've also chosen that rhythm so that you have plenty of time to work on not only your final paper, but also if you choose to do the bonus project, which is that final paper and bonus project are just a different sort of rhythm and a different kind of assignment. So in the next coming weeks, probably in the beginning of June, I'll post some Zoom meeting signups so that if you choose to submit a draft also for bonus, then you can schedule a time that we can meet and I can review your paper, usually 30 minutes over Zoom. Sometimes it's really only 15 if I've had enough time to review your paper beforehand. Now, Module 2 is all about the opening chapters of the Bible. Last week, I closed our weekly video with a prayer that sort of echoed creation, and you're going to hear echoes of creation in these first few chapters of Genesis, starting with the Genesis 1 and 2 creation stories and leading up until the flood. We're not going to cover a whole lot of ground in Genesis, and that's unfortunately because there's a lot that's there. I spent an entire semester at Princeton translating Genesis and diving deep just into its stories and narratives that are present there. For our course, we're just going to focus on the first few chapters because they're foundational, not just for the Christian faith, but also foundational for our understanding of the Bible and how it communicates to us what the Bible is really about. These chapters give us this real in-depth look, and though hopefully you'll appreciate this slower pace at the beginning, later on it's going to feel a little bit like we're pressing the skip button like on Netflix, and we're going to cover a lot more. So as we close our time together, I'm going to offer a few thoughts to keep in mind. There's a little chart at the bottom of the first section that kind of breaks up the difference between the first creation story and the second. And as you sort of look at those creation accounts, you're hopefully pause and wonder at what God, as God's creating, calls very good. And we're called to sort of pause and wonder at the jewel of the world that God's created, because it is very good. And Genesis 1 has this much more orderly account. That's why there's that chart there of things that are very good. Whereas Genesis 2 is this much more organic narrative that focuses more on these literary elements of character, setting, plot, climax, resolution, and point. Please just go through that little section and that will give a little bit more on that. Genesis 1 is first and foremost, it's poetry, and it's liturgical poetry. And it's used to prompt people's memories and caution us for how we interpret. If you know just a little bit about poetry, maybe you can remember back to your English, high school English days, that literal interpretations of poetry don't always necessarily work the best, because literal interpretations kind of interfere with logistics. If you know the line from Emily Dickinson, "Hope is a thing with feathers," we know that hope doesn't literally have feathers. And so just consider that as you're reading some of these elements in the Genesis story of what kind of story is this trying to tell, and what are sort of these salient theological truths that's coming out of it. Both of these accounts give us these theological truths about God's character. In Genesis 1, we see a God who's transcendent, a God who's over us and who's unique and supreme and sovereign. Whereas in Genesis 2, we see this much more immanent, near God who's one of us, with us and present and really intimately involved. And we also see, compared to the Enuma Elish, that God is not like other gods. And it's a polemic, and a polemic means something that's like a bold statement about a particular truth. So as you think back to the Enuma Elish that was talked about in the videos, or maybe look forward to it, there's this other creation myth called the Epic of, I'm not going to say this right, but Atrahasis, which was created in the 1600 BCE, and other Sumerian, Mesopotamian, and Egyptian accounts. And there's a difference in the way they portray their gods, or a god, depending upon the myth that's being told. And there's a distinct difference between the creator in Genesis and these other gods and other stories. The Genesis creation account has bold statements against these others, whereas while these other creation myths kind of see there's this like family tree, and there's conflict among the gods, and there's this kind of lack of interest in this primeval chaos happening in this polytheism, the Judeo-Christian story of creation is a polemic against these divine beings that seem to be chaotic or conflict-driven, or even really disengaged with what they've created or what's been created. And rather, we see a God in Genesis that's immanent or personal and transcendent, who creates order out of chaos and conflict, and is most importantly engaged and involved with creation. And hopefully, as you see that, maybe engaged and involved with your story of creation. I know one time when I've taught this class in person at Northwestern, I remember a student reflecting on how the creation stories showed us that God is involved, even though sometimes it doesn't feel that way. And I know in our daily life, sometimes we wonder, where's God? And that's the sort of important theological conversation that we need to sort of reflect on regularly. But also something to note, and that's different in Genesis, is that we see that chaos is actually something. It's the Hebrew tohu vavohu, which means that God isn't creating out of nothing, which is an old sort of theological concept called ex nihilo, but actually that God creates something from this raw, formless material. And it means it's not neither nothing nor something, but God is sort of present and active in this undifferentiated mass and involved in each step along the way. Another important point is that God's movement throughout these creation stories is not random, but it's purposeful. By the time we get to Genesis 3 through 4, we know that sin has spread and that things are not the way they're supposed to be. And the conclusions that sin has now passed from Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel are now our sin, and their judgments, our judgment, and now their death is our death. And these consequences are universal in scope. We don't have to look too far to see how we're affected by death and sin on a daily basis, or the dysfunctions we might encounter daily. We know that things are not the way they're supposed to be. And yet, even as sin has sort of spread rampantly and there's every inclination of evil taking place, we're told something about how how feels in this, that God's grieved, that his heart is disappointed and he's brokenhearted and he's about ready to blot the whole thing out. But we also see, this is another instance of a polemic, a story of what God's not like. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is sort of a mirror story to the flood story, we encounter this sort of capricious or mean God. But in Genesis, and particularly in the flood story, we see a God who's deeply grieved. And so just kind of think about those sort of interesting emotions and sort of how God reflects this sense of deep emotion in God's life. God's not necessarily this static being without emotion that we sometimes think he is, but sometimes, but as we who are created in God's image also reflect this aspect of God's character, which means we're emotionally complex. We know that God is also emotionally complex, and that's a beautiful part of being created in God's image. And hopefully you see some of those elements that come out in the biblical story. Sorry for the tractor noise in the background. I'm at my parents' ranch in Nebraska, so you'll hear cattle mooing and all that in the back. But I do want to close our time together with one of my favorite poems that sort of looks at sort of these emotional complexities that are happening in the creation stories as well as in the flood. And particularly, it's a moment happening kind of after sin has entered the world in Genesis 3 through 4. And it's called One Foot in Eden by Edwin Muir. 1 foot in Eden, still I stand and look across the other land. The world's great day is growing late, yet strange these fields that we have planted, so long with crops of love and hate. Time's handiworks by time are haunted, and nothing now can separate. The corn and tares compactly grown, and a memorial weed in stillness found. Above the stalk, these are our own. Evil and good stand thick around in fields of charity and sin, where we shall lead our harvest in. Yet still from Eden springs the root as clean as on the starting day. Time takes the foliage and the fruit and burns the archetypal leaf to shapes of terror and of grief, scattered along the wintered way. But famished field and blackened tree bear flowers in Eden never known. Blossoms of grief and charity bloom in these darkened fields alone. This is my favorite line and the most important one. What had Eden ever to say of hope and faith and pity and love, until was buried all its day and memory found its treasure trove? Strange blessings never in paradise fall from these beclouded skies. What had Eden ever to say of faith and hope and pity and love? I think this is important for us to realize that the story of creation and the story of the fall is not all gloom and doom, but there's some hope in the picture. There's some strange blessings that come about, like Eve is named, or that Adam and Eve are able to leave together and they're not separated, or even the strange blessing that though they do die eventually, their death is delayed. They don't die instantly, but God's warning is more of a spiritual death. There's a sense that God gives them protection, that they won't live in a sinful life forever, but when they're expelled from Eden, they might not be able to return, but they also, God doesn't lock them forever in this state of immorality and sin. And then lastly, there's this promise, strange blessing of a promise that God has given, sort of a veiled promise of salvation and rebirth. And so as we sort of close, I just want you to reflect on all those sort of elements that were talked about, but just know that this story would be really short if it ended right at Genesis 1 through 2 or even 3. So what does it mean that sin has entered the world? We know that that means things are broken or not the way they're supposed to. And yet there's a foreshadowing of salvation that is to come. There's a sense that the story would be short if it ended here, and that there's something more that we're called towards, this arc of redemption. And so I'm praying that as you enter this course, that you're able to see this movement towards redemption, this movement towards the final feast, which is where the class will end. So thank you so much, and I'm eager and excited to continue to engage with you in the course. Hope you have a good week. Bye.